Okay, so I know these DC films are divisive and everything, but at least we can all agree that Purple Lamborghini is the best pop song to come out of them so far. Right? Right?
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast, where we discuss the world of film from a fresh angle. And now your host, Robert Yaniz Jr.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast. This is Rob. On this episode, we're going to be talking about DC, nothing but DC. After we had a big Marvel conversation last episode, talking about Thor Ragnarok, this week we're swinging across the street to the other side of the comic book universe, to DC and Warner Brothers. In the lead up to Justice League's release, we're going to be talking about the DC films. That's the thing. DC Extended Universe is technically not the official title for this franchise, or so the studio has claimed, so we've heard, and they haven't really branded it a specific title. We'll get more into that later, but we're going to be talking about the DC films thus far, and particularly getting into Man of Steel. But before we get into all of that, I saw Murder on the Orient Express this week. That is, of course, the new film from director Kenneth Branagh, who also stars as Hercule Poirot, the famed detective from the Agatha Christie novel that the film is based on. It's been adapted a bunch of times for the big screen, most notably in the 70s with Albert Finney in that lead role as the famous detective. And it features an ensemble cast of Judi Dench, Michelle Pfeiffer, Daisy Ridley, Josh Gad, Johnny Depp, just a bunch of people. And, going in, I didn't really have very much familiarity with the source material or the other film versions of the story. I knew, it was a murder mystery. Somebody died on the train. I even knew who it was. But I didn't really know what the big twist was or what the big reveal was going to be. So I pretty much went in cold. And for the most part, the film starts out and it feels very classical. It feels sort of like a throwback to old Hollywood in some ways. And that, I think that tone really fit this material. I think that style was a wise choice for Branagh as director. I think his performance is really a lot of fun. You kind of get a sense of his personal life, but it doesn't really overwhelm the matter at hand. And he has some light moments, and he really demonstrates why he is the world famous detective that he is. And looking for a break from his criminal work, and sort of stumbles onto this train with a motley group of individuals, and of course a murder mystery happens right on the train as he's trying to take a holiday. And the film it's fine. I wasn't blown away by it. I thought it was decent entertainment, decent way to spend a couple hours, mostly because of Branagh's performance and the style of the film, the direction and stuff. The cast is, of course, solid. They're good with what they have to work with. Most of them are very underdeveloped, and you don't really get a lot of performance moments from them. Specifically, people like Judi Dench. I mean, they put a bunch of great actors in this movie, and most of them don't really have much to do. I think Josh Gad probably had some of the more interesting moments from the film. Johnny Depp has some, a couple really tense scenes. But for the most part, I felt like a lot of these actors were sort of above the material. The pace is very all over the place. A lot of it is him just interviewing people and trying to piece it together that way. And it isn't particularly compelling. The film never really seems to ratchet up its momentum until it gets towards the end. And then just when you feel like it's starting to resolve itself, there's another complication, and it kind of continues on and on a little bit more. And the ultimate reveal to me was, for people that know the story, you know what you're getting, and you probably will walk out relatively satisfied by this. But the film, these kinds of movies are all about engaging the audience, and the ultimate reveal as to the culprit, I felt, is sort of a cop-out in a lot of ways. It's not one I saw coming, but it also wasn't one that satisfied me. You're supposed to walk out of these kinds of films when the murderer is revealed and like, oh, damn, that's what was going on. Instead, I was like, I had much more of a, oh, okay, well, I guess, whatever. And that's not exactly the reaction you want. So it's a decent film for what it is. Unless you're like really into these kinds of movies, I probably wouldn't bother with it. It doesn't transcend its genre in any way. If you're a hardcore Kenneth Branagh fan, or you really like Agatha Christie, or whodunits are really your jam, then you might love this one. But for me, I was just kind of a 3 out of 5, which is good, but not really that good. It's kind of, for me, I assign 3 when I'm kind of on the fence about a movie, and I was like, yeah, no, that was a movie, and you walk out and you spent your 2 hours, and you don't necessarily regret it, but you're also like, that's done now. What else can I do with my evening? And that's kind of how I felt about this movie. It wasn't super impressive to me. Again, there's only so much you can do with that source material. If this is the story that he's working with, and this is what Agatha Christie's novel was, then, I don't know how true it was to that book, but I'm assuming that at least the reveal was right out of the pages. And that, to me, was kind of deflated a lot of, most of the interest I had in the movie. And at a certain point, I was just wanted it to be over. So that was Murder on the Orient Express. I'm not actually sure how it did at the box office this weekend. Probably not that great. I can't imagine it had that big of a turnout. Especially with Thor Ragnarok still killing it, and this kind of being the film released in between Thor Ragnarok and Justice League, or at least one of the films. And so yeah, that's my thoughts on that. Before we delve deep into DC land, I wanted to share my reaction to that film. So going in here, that sets us up for our discussion of the DC film slate thus far. Previous episodes, we've talked about, actually Kai and I both talked about Wonder Woman, Suicide Squad, and Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice. So if you're looking for really in-depth reviews for those films, the links to those episodes will be in the show notes below. And as far as this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit later about kind of my general thoughts on the DC films slate, or DC Extended Universe, whatever we want to call it now. But I'm not really going to get super in-depth on those particular films, since I've already talked about them. However, we are going to talk about Man of Steel, kind of wrap up all of the reviews on the Crooked Table podcast for these DC movies. I felt like a sense of unfinished business with that, and this seemed like as good an opportunity as any to go back to the beginning of the DC film, since Justice League is essentially the end of, we'll put in air quotes, the DC Extended Universe Phase 1. If the Avengers was the end of Phase 1 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, then it stands to reason that Justice League would sort of be the culmination of sorts for this particular set of films that Man of Steel introduced us to the world. BVS sort of fleshed it out. Wonder Woman and Suicide Squad were sort of their own things, and then this is kind of the third part of this initial Superman trilogy, sort of. So that being said, let's move into our review of Man of Steel.
How do you find someone who has spent a lifetime covering his tracks? For some, he was a guardian angel. For others, a ghost who never quite fit in.
You will give the people of Earth an ideal to strive towards. They will race behind you. They will stumble. They will fall. But in time, they will join you in the sun. In time, you will help them accomplish wonders.
It just feels wrong to cut off that Hans Zimmer score like that. But if I let it go, we'll just sit here and end up listening to the whole soundtrack. So, of course, for those of you who haven't heard reviews on this podcast before, we're going to talk about the hype, the story, the cast, the production, and finally the verdict. So, Man of Steel. So, going into this one with the hype, this is, of course, came out in 2013, the summer of 2013, to be more exact. And this was a critical juncture for the Warner Brothers DC Comics line. This is the year after the Avengers came out, the year after Christopher Nolan wrapped up his Dark Knight trilogy. This is 7 years after Superman Returns came out. It was sort of an homage to the Christopher Reeve Superman films, and kind of underperformed at the box office. Got middling reviews, and it's not that great a film, to be fair. It is kind of deserving of a lot of the, I guess, apathy to that movie. Brandon Routh is fine in it, but the story itself is all over the place, and I think a little too reverent to the original Donner films, that it didn't really contribute too much of its own that was at least satisfying. But that's another podcast for another day. We're talking about Man of Steel. So there was a lot of chatter about this possibly being DC's, the launch pad for their own cinematic universe, sort of their Iron Man, as it were. And, there was some discussion that Green Lantern was going to be that 2 years earlier, and we all know how that turned out. So, the hype for Man of Steel was really about how this is kind of a make or break moment for DC Comics and their hopes for a shared universe. And me personally, I was looking forward to it because I was already a fan of Zack Snyder. For the most part, I still haven't seen the Owl movie, the Legends of the Guardians, whatever it is, something with Legends and Guardians, and I haven't seen that. Sucker Punch is not good, admittedly. Visually great, but I am a big fan of the Dawn of the Dead remake that he did. I'm a moderate fan of 300, and I really love Watchmen, so I have to find a reason to talk about Watchmen on here at some point. So him being involved and knowing that he can handle comic book material really well, the fact that Christopher Nolan was on board as a producer, and the fact that David Goyer was behind it, and I know he was also involved in Batman Begins. It had the trailer has a lot, as you heard a little bit, has a lot of flashbacks and allusions to his story prior to becoming Superman, but it delivered in a very non-linear way and felt very much Nolan-y in that way. So going into it, I was hopeful that this was going to be a really strong Superman movie, and admittedly, the character has always been kind of hard to nail on screen. He has got these godlike powers and is essentially invincible, and this movie doesn't even bother bringing kryptonite into it. Oh, I should probably mention, I will delve into spoilers along the way, but this movie's been out 4 years, so if you haven't seen it by now, you probably don't really care anymore at this point. Something about Superman, because it's hard to maintain stakes with him, you never really feel like he's threatened. It has been very mixed bag as far as these movies. The first Christopher Reeve movie is really great. The second one is a mess, a mixed bag. The second one's a mixed bag. And the third and fourth are a mess. And Man of Steel had a lot of hope riding on it. So going into the story, what was the deal with this movie? Well, we already know that his planet blew up. He was sent away from it as a baby. He lands on Earth, found by the Kents, blah, 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 grows up in Kansas, and becomes Superman. However, with this one, I felt that the film brought a very unique spin to the origin story. This was story by David S. Goyer and Christopher Nolan, screenplay by David S. Goyer, who wrote the Blade movies, Batman Begins, I already said. And I think that it has all the elements that we're expecting, but it does it in a different way. Krypton here isn't all about crystals. It's not this, black room with people with white hair and speaking very robotically, Kal-El. It's very Avatar influenced in a lot of ways. There's flying beasts, there's bright colors, and I think that the reimagining of Krypton made it feel like a real world rather than a set in a studio where you just have Marlon Brando wearing a funny outfit. And I think that was a strong start for this one. I think we spend about probably 20-30 minutes on Krypton, so you actually get to know the Kal-El and Lara and Zod and that dynamic, and they explore that with a little bit of an environmental message, I'd say, but they explore that a little more than just, oh, here he is, boom, the planet blew up. You have the concept of the Codex. You have the idea that Kryptonians are bred from birth with a specific purpose, and that plays into General Zod's his motivation. And then you have the world engine. You have this idea about General Zod being so zealous for his home world that he's willing to destroy Earth to sort of repopulate Krypton there. And there's a really interesting kind of natural selection thing going on with that. There are some missteps, of course. I think Pa Kent's death was really ill-conceived. I think it's kind of problematic in a lot of ways. It makes sense that he's trying to protect his son, and doesn't want his son to reveal himself. But at the same time, it does suspension of disbelief. There are some logic gaps as far as Clark's ability to save his father and then continue to keep his secret. I do like all the stuff with the tone that it is. Like I said, it is very Superman Begins in a way, cross-cutting between him sort of as a drifter, as an adult man, and then flashing back to his childhood, to his father's death, to his discovery of his alien origins. And I thought that tone and that pacing kept the story moving along. Whereas if they had just gone narratively through this would have felt a lot more similar to Superman the movie than it really should have. Thanks to Nolan, I'd say, in large part. And I think thanks to him, it does feel grounded in the right places. But, given the source material and given this character's nature, it is fantastical in all the right places as well. I think that the film gets a bad rap, honestly, in a lot of ways. A lot of people bulk this in there with BVS, and which makes sense because BVS is the sequel to this. But in a lot of ways, I feel like Man of Steel nails its storyline and is a lot more focused than BVS is, I think, and we'll get to that in a second. This movie is accused of being joyless, and I feel like the flight scene where Superman flies in his uniform for the first time is majestic as fuck and kind of inspiring in a lot of ways, and I think Hans Zimmer's score really helps that. I think the criticism with the destruction in Metropolis is, warranted, but at least, wisely they addressed that in the next film and made that an integral part of the story. And I really also I also feel like a lot of critics didn't quite resonate with the purpose and the meaning of Zod's death and the fact that Superman is forced to kill him and basically destroy the last remnant of his homeworld and choose one planet over the other and commit this unspeakable act. I mean, it's not like he just, he had a million options at his disposal and he's just like, what, the easiest thing is just break his neck. Screw it. I ain't got time for this mess. They do build up to that a lot. Zod is about to kill innocent people. There's nothing that Superman can do to stop him. Zod repeatedly is saying, I will never stop. This was my one purpose, was to just protect Krypton and my people, and you took it away from me. I'm going to take out this vengeance on this planet forever. You're never going to be able to stop me. It's basically what he's saying right before Superman kills him. So it's not like Superman has an out there. And then his kind of scream of horror afterwards, of realizing what he's done and the weight of that, in that he essentially had to forsake Krypton in order to save Earth. He killed a Kryptonian, one of the only remaining ones, in order to save this family of Earthlings. And I think that says that's basically a symbolic choice between Krypton and Earth. And he made his choice, and he's now struggling and suffering with that and feeling the weight of his decision and everything that happened there. So I thought that was really captured in that moment, and I never really understood why people bitched so much about Superman's decision in that moment. Moving on to the cast. The story, like I said, I like for the most part, has its issues, which I'll mention a little bit more as we go along. Talking about the cast. So Henry Cavill here I thought was... I wasn't really super familiar with him. I know he had a smallish role in The Count of Monte Cristo in 2002, and I didn't know that until after this movie. I was like, hey, holy shit, that was the kid from The Count of Monte Cristo, just like 11 years earlier. He's obviously very good looking and very in shape and very, takes a different approach to this character than Christopher Reeves. I think that's what sunk Brandon Routh's performance in Superman Returns and led him to like a little bit of a career detour before he found his way to Legends of Tomorrow and such. I think Henry Cavill looks like Superman enough that it fits the part, but he doesn't he doesn't, it doesn't come off that he's trying to do an impersonation of what's come before. It feels very much its own thing, and it feels very present, it feels like a present day interpretation of this character. You can't have the super clean being like, oh, it's I'm here for the American way. You can't do that anymore. This is a more complicated time. Yes, Superman should be that, but he's not just going to emerge out of the ether as that. And I think that this film is really showing him struggling with the human side of himself, as represented by the choice between Zod and that family of people in the whatever building that was. I forget. It's like a library or museum or something. And I think Cavill really brought it here. He when he emotes, sometimes it works more than others. I feel like that scream after Zod's death was very powerful, and I think that moment totally works. And I'm gonna stand by that. Amy Adams here is Lois. She's not quite as plucky as the versions of Terry Hatcher or Erica Durance. But I do think that they modernized the character a lot. In order to be the Daily Planet's top reporter, you have to be sharp and intelligent, and you have to be kind of a badass and willing to force your way into places to get the story. And I think Amy Adams is such a great actress that she embodies that sort of self-assuredness effortlessly. And I like the fact in this movie that they do away with the whole Lois be working beside Clark and being like, oh, Clark is so great, but Superman, oh, they're totally different people, right? It's not at all the glasses. And I think this was a smart way around that by having her sort of find out about Clark Kent before Superman is even a thing, and they sidestep that whole suspension of disbelief, which has always been kind of ridiculous, but I feel like more so now would undermine the fact that Lois Lane is supposed to be this highly respected reporter if she can't even figure out that these two people that she's in close contact with constantly are the same person. I think they found a smart way around that by having their relationship not necessarily begin when they start working together at the Daily Planet. Michael Shannon is Zod. Like I said, he has a much greater motivation, that character, and Michael Shannon has that natural intensity, and yeah, he's hamming it up here, but he's playing a comic book villain and one who's a megalomaniac in a lot of ways, and so every time he screams out, I will find him, I think it fits the character, and it fits that sort of big performance that we routinely get from villains. You could say for sure Zod is a much better villain than we'll get in. Lex Luthor, I have mixed feelings on. He's a much better villain than a lot of these other films, and I'm going to say it. I think that for the most part, this Michael Shannon's performance is definitely better than most Marvel villains in the cinematic universe. There, Lawrence Fishburne and Diane Lane as Perry White and Martha Kent. Can't even say Martha now without laughing. They're fine with what they have. Their roles here are very utilitarian in a lot of ways. But to me, really, the VIPs of this movie are the Robin Hood dads. Russell Crowe has some great stuff here. He makes Jor-El much more interesting than Marlon Brando's sort of monotone delivery in the original Richard Donner film. And I think Kevin Costner gets some of them. He's really the emotional heart of this film in a lot of ways. You have that scene where young Clark, he tells him about that they found him in the spaceship and all of that. And Clark says to him, "Can I just pretend that I'm your son?" And he's like, "You are my son." And like those emotional heart to hearts where he's saying, "Should I not save people?" And he's like, "Well, maybe, I don't know. You have to find your own way. You were brought to us for a purpose. I have to believe that." All that stuff was great, and I love the fact that even though his death scene, like I mentioned, I have issues with, I think that Kevin Costner really embodies the sort of down-home, like, earthiness that Jonathan Kent is supposed to represent. And Russell Crowe as Jor-El, like I mentioned, he has a lot of great stuff to do, even in, like, the towards the third act of the movie, kind of guiding Lois Lane, and it's a much more active role than just, I'm in the first 20 minutes and I got killed. And I think that was an interesting way to have him basically be, like, the embodiment of Jor-El guiding, like almost like a guidance system on that ship. I think that was all really cool, and I think the actors do a great job with it. And going into the production, one of the things that really bugged me about this movie when I saw it in theaters in 2013 was the product placement. The IHOP is like smacking you upside the head, and there's a couple, I think there's a Sears or something. There's a couple other ones that are really obnoxious product placement, but Warner Brothers got to get paid, I guess. And more than that, the third act of this film, as it's notorious for being, is ridiculously heavy with CGI. I think that they overdid that quite a bit, and it set an unfortunate precedent for most of the DCEU or DC films, whatever. We'll get into that name in a second. Slate, even Wonder Woman, which most critics really loved and most fans really loved, and was sort of a pop cultural phenomenon this year. Even that falls into that trap with the whole Ares battle towards the end. Of course, you can't have a Superman movie without the religious symbolism. This one's still heavy on that. Not quite. I don't think it's quite as obvious as in Superman Returns, where he's literally falling to Earth in the messianic pose. But it's kind of hard to argue that it does work with this material. The whole Superman as Jesus metaphor comes from the stars to save us all. I mean, it's kind of inherent in who this character is, and it's an easy access point for audiences. So I don't really slight this movie too much, or Zack Snyder, for going that route. As I mentioned, Hans Zimmer's score here is incredible. Really powerful. Like playing that clip from the trailer, it was hard for me to find a place to cut it off, because that music is very stirring, and I would have loved to have left more in there, but we had to get down to business here. I'm not sure how much of that score, the Zimmer theme, is going to be carried over into Justice League. Some of it, I know Danny Elfman's did the score to that, but I really hope that they keep that main riff when eventually Superman comes back. Spoilers, I guess, for Justice League. It's not quite as iconic as the John Williams one, of course, but to me it is a worthy successor, and in a more modern context. That very old school, that feels like a very specific time in cinema history, and this one is more complicated, very Inception-y and orchestral in the same way, orchestral but in a different way, and I think it really fits this film. And to me, the Man of Steel theme is probably still the strongest one. Well, it's up there with the Wonder Woman riff, let's put it that way. The visual effects here, of course, are mostly strong, though, like I said, I think they did go for it a little too much in the third act. It's a lot of overkill just with the destruction, and I feel like the film is, a little over 2 hours. I think it's maybe 2:15 or something like that. And I think they could have easily, 2 hours and 20 minutes. And I think they could have easily cut maybe 10 minutes of some of the destruction. I think, Zack Snyder's an action movie director at his core. He's not nearly as bombastic and lacking in or hollow as someone like Michael Bay, but I feel like in some instances, and I think the Battle of Metropolis is probably an example of that, he does fall into that more explosions trap a little bit here, and in BVS as well. I think Goyer's screenplay, as I mentioned, has problems. Admittedly, especially in certain moments like the Superman Lois Lane kiss, where she's like, "Oh, they say it's all downhill from the first kiss," and he says, "Oh, I think that only counts when you're referring to humans." And I was like, okay, that's a terrible line. It's terribly written, and other than that, I have a lot of issues with, as I said, certain elements of the story. It's overextended. It's kind of meandering a little bit. It's definitely, the film is definitely too long. And, had it been trimmed down to a nice brisk 2 hours, I think it would have been an even more successful film. That being said, going into the verdict, still for me, Man of Steel is nearly the best Superman movie. I put it behind Superman the movie just because there is a little too much indulgence going on here with the destruction of Metropolis. There's some stuff there's some character beats that don't quite work. There's, it feels like it's trying to make the same points sometimes over and over, and I feel like you don't need all of that. I think somebody should have edited this down a little bit more and made it a much tighter film, and that's, in BVS, I feel like it has the opposite problem, where should have just removed subplots entirely or held them for other movies. But that's a different thing. I feel like Man of Steel is also nearly the best DC Extended Universe film. I'd put it right behind Wonder Woman, which I think is is more successful as far as keeping the focus on Diana's story, and it doesn't overextend things too long. It's roughly the same length, but I feel like it has more story to tell in some ways. And part of that could be because so much of the Superman origin we already know. It does reinvent a lot of the most, we're talking about the most well-known comic book origin story this side of Gotham City, and it retains most of the key elements of that, but really modernizes the characters and hones in on Superman's evolution in an interesting way. I mean, this is a movie where he doesn't start as the hero that we know and love. He doesn't even, it's not a linear progression. It's sort of back and forth until a certain point, and then it's kind of about the necessity for him to reveal himself to the world and the complications that arise when he does that. Will people accept him, blah, blah, blah. And BVS just extends that even further after all the destruction during the fight with Zod and all of that. In this movie, he only just starts the job at the Daily Planet in the final scene. So I think it's an interesting way of whereas most Superman origin stories would start out of, we got a new report. Even Superman the movie actually starts that way. It's one of the first scenes. After the whole Krypton, you get the Krypton prologue, and then it's, Miss Lane, this is Clark Kent, new reporter of the Daily Planet, blah, blah, blah. And this movie is all about everything that happens before that point, before he decides, I should get a job as a reporter so I can keep my ear to the ground of what's happening so I can actually save more people that way. And it's an interesting arc that Zack Snyder sets in motion here, and hopefully one that'll pay off in Justice League. So that's my thoughts on Man of Steel. Now we're going to talk a little bit more into the DC films to date and what we're looking forward to in the future. So as I said, Man of Steel for me was a very successful start to the DC Extended Universe, and really, really energized Superman in a way that he hadn't been in quite some time. I'd say probably since the Christopher Reeve days. None of the other many incarnations of the character really resonated on such a grand scale as Christopher Reeve, so everybody was inevitably compared to him. But Man of Steel was a great start. So that being said, I was really looking forward to BVS. And I think that film has a boatload of issues. I could probably write a feature. In fact, I would like to write a feature either for crookedtable.com or elsewhere about all the things that I do like about that movie. One of the ones is that it's basically the entire film is about the fallout to the Battle of Metropolis. It's about Superman balancing the good that he does versus the harm that he inflicts versus being accepted by Earth and the U.S. government in particular, and his accountability there. It in a lot of ways has a lot of similarities to Civil War in that it's about these heroes and these with these extraordinary powers and what they can or can't do, and how they should or shouldn't use those powers in a real world context. I think BVS tries to lend some gravitas to that and doesn't do it to me as well as Civil War does, in just having those heroes sit around a table and discuss, this isn't right because what if we want to go here and they won't let us, and blah blah blah, and presenting two opposing viewpoints. I feel like BVS is half a Batman movie and half Man of Steel sequel, and it doesn't really balance the two very well. Instead, you kind of mash Batman in with Superman's sort of moral dilemma, and I think in doing so in the film, in taking a Superman film and essentially turning it into a Batman film where it even opens and closes with Batman, I think you really doing a disservice to Batman in a lot of ways. In that his portrayal, Ben Affleck's portrayal here, even though I love Batman, as you guys know, and I think Affleck was really great in the role, he comes off like we don't really quite get on his side in this film, and we understand why he feels the way he does, and that whole sequence with the concluding events in Man of Steel from Bruce Wayne's perspective is really strong. That's the thing about BVS. I have like something, I could tell you just as many things that I like about it as that I don't like about it. And for me, that's why it sits at, like I said, with Murder on the Orient Express, that's why it sits right at a 3 out of 5, because I there's a lot of things I appreciate, and then there's just And then every time I come across a scene that I really like, or a character moment that I really love, or, you know, a performance or whatever, it cuts to Granny's peach tea, or it cuts to Martha, you got to save Martha, or one of those really kind of insipid things about the movie that just frustrates the shit out of me. But it tries to do too much too soon. I think as far as the DC films on the whole, I think BVS was where the executives there just basically put their foot down and like, no, we want fucking Justice League. We want our Avengers money. Make it happen now. Bring Batman in, bring Wonder Woman in, Doomsday, blah, blah, blah. Just get through that shit, make it happen. And in that way, I feel like you know how they were saying that Justice League was going to be 2 movies initially? I feel like BVS should have been 2 movies. I feel like you should have had Superman with his, the Man of Steel sequel, and then brought in Batman. Or even vice versa. Maybe Man of Steel should have been, you know, Man of Steel was a great start. Then present maybe the Batman thing, involve, you know, his side, you know, there's 2 years between Man of Steel and BVS. Have him sort of witness the thing in Man of Steel at the beginning, and then have that kind of be lingering in the back of his mind for 2 years while he's dealing with Red Hood or whatever, and that could have been the Batman setting up the confrontation where at the end of that film, he'll make a decision to pursue taking down Superman, and then when we start the big showdown between Batman and Superman, we're more invested in Batman's side of it. I think that would have been a much better way to do it, as opposed to just making Man of Steel and then boom, BVS, you get 5 minutes with Bruce Wayne. You're like, see, because he doesn't trust him because of this. And I think that the film doesn't give us enough time to marinate in that while showing how much else Batman has on his plate. That to me would have been a better way to do it. That being said, I really like, you know, it gave us Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman. We all know that turned out wonderfully. And I'm gonna out myself here. I've said it on the podcast before. I actually really thought Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor performance had a lot of fun moments to it. It's not the performance that I would have wanted for that character. I was hoping that Mark Strong or John Hamm or somebody older, more in line with Batman's age, and, you know, older than Superman, because he's traditionally older than Superman, even in Smallville, would have played that. I like my Lex Luthor in a suit, like the Clancy Brown animated version of Lex Luthor, and sort of intimidating Superman that way. And this was an alternative take. I mean, this was trying to literally take the guy who played Mark Zuckerberg and have him play like a spoiled rich kid with a god complex and trying to prove a point about, you know, all this religious bullshit. And that got really convoluted. I still want to see... I want it to be revealed that that's Lex Luthor Jr., and I would like Mark Strong or John Hamm or somebody like that, because Mark Strong was so great as Sinestro, one of the only good things about Green Lantern, and I would have loved to have seen him come into this, you know, this franchise as Lex Luthor. I still want it to be revealed that Jesse Eisenberg is playing Lex Luthor Jr. and have his dad come in and be the Lex Luthor that we want to see. And maybe that will still happen, because in a lot of ways, Man of Steel, BVS, and Justice League are getting, supposedly, this is what I think Zack Snyder or Goyer or somebody said years ago, and I've really been sticking to this, that these 3 films present an arc that leads us to the Superman that is the symbol of hope and optimism and, you know, that idealistic hero that we know Superman to be in the form of Christopher Reeve and Dean Cain and Tom Welling and blah, blah, blah. So that being said, Lex Luthor, the real Lex Luthor, we could, if they want to play it this way and sort of retcon it, we could have not even met the real Lex Luthor, because Jesse Eisenberg could have just been his spoiled little shit son, and you can just sweep that away since people didn't react to it. That's my thoughts for Lex Luthor. But on the whole, there's a lot of ideas and moments in BVS that I really like. There's a lot of cinematography and shots that really stick with me. I do think the Ultimate Edition is a vast improvement. And I do think that, like the Ultimate Cut of Watchmen, another Zack Snyder thing, obviously, I feel like it plays better in a way as 3-hour-long episodes of like a mini-series. I mean, I've even watched BVS, and there are sort of natural cut-off points within that, the Ultimate Edition. that I think, the first one being right at the end when Holly Hunter, whoever news people are talking about Superman and, do we really need a Superman? And there's the montage of him dragging the ship and saving the people on the roof and all that stuff. And I think that is ends that on a big question mark, thematically setting up kind of the ongoing story with him and the explosion in the courthouse and all that. And then the other one, of course, being right around the fight night, Man of Steel or whatever, I forget, day versus night, that whole thing, and then kind of teasing into the Batman and Superman fight and the Doomsday versus the Trinity, Wonder Woman, and all of them, that battle, and the more action heavy conclusion of it all. I think that those natural breaking points make BVS Ultimate Edition, at least, a more satisfying experience. And if you have the Ultimate Edition of BVS on Blu-ray or DVD, or you check it out, if you haven't seen it, you definitely should see it. I think it makes the film a little bit stronger and clarifies some of the issues that a lot of people had with it. It's still not a perfect movie by any means. It's a hard one for me to even defend as a good movie, honestly. But there are a lot of elements in there. It's very ambitious in a lot of ways. And, whereas the Marvel movies are routinely good to great, I'd say most of the Marvel movies are just good. They're fun, they're fine, they're entertaining, but they're not necessarily like, oh my god, that was amazing. I don't know who came out of Ant-Man being like, that was the best thing I've ever seen. The Marvel movies are usually 3.5, sometimes 4, but mostly 3.5 out of 5. And then BVS, still not as good as that, but it does aim higher, and it does have a more ambitious style to it, and narrative and themes, and it's trying to take on more, even if it doesn't stick the landing quite as much. Of course, after BVS, for some reason or another, we got Suicide Squad. And that movie, I sort of, you can listen to the podcast where Kai and I talk about that. Again, like I said, there's also one for BVS and Wonder Woman. I found Suicide Squad entertaining at the time, despite the fact that it does feel very inconsequential in a lot of ways, which you would think would free it up to be a better movie, since it's tied to the shared universe, but it's not as tied as BVS is, like super linked to Man of Steel and Justice League, and basically it's the bridge between those two. Suicide Squad has a lot of things that work for it and a lot of things that don't. Most things that don't. I think some of the performances are fun. Viola Davis, Will Smith, Margot Robbie, those in particular. Jared Leto is even more divisive and I think less successful than Jesse Eisenberg in my opinion. And the storyline is sort of all over the place. Suicide Squad to me is very much a guilty pleasure. I own it on Blu-ray. I'm clearly a completist for these freaking movies. Marvel and DC, so I'm not picking sides. They both have insanely genius movies, and they both have insanely ridiculously shit movies. And I think Suicide Squad is definitely more on the latter side of that. But it's I still enjoy it even though it's not good. I don't know why. I think it's just the fact that there's a movie that exists where Killer Croc is a big part of it, where Captain Boomerang is a character for some reason. So I admire the fact that we're getting these characters come to life for the first time. And then you have, a lot of fun random lines, random moments. But let's break it down. Margot Robbie is the saving grace of that movie. So it makes sense that they're going all in on her as Harley Quinn for either Gotham City's Sirens or the Joker and Harley Quinn movie or whatever the hell they're doing with her. They're definitely locking her down to a multi-picture deal, and I think that's a smart move. I didn't even say in BVS about the cameos from the other Justice League members. Yeah, that's terrible and ridiculously shoehorned in. And if you look at the Avengers and how well those characters were knitted together, and then you look at BVS where there's an email with little video clips with logos already for some reason, it's horribly done. But Suicide Squad does feel very much like, and then let's throw this out. It comes out of left field, and it kind of has nothing to do with the development of the main part of this world, which is, of course, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, and the Justice League. And it's essentially a curveball that comes out of nowhere, and they basically trying to see which characters people will respond to. And surprise, surprise, Harley Quinn. I could have told you that before the movie came out. So there's not really so much I have to say about Suicide Squad. I just hope that with the sequel, I know they've talked about Black Adam potentially being the villain there. I just hope that they take it up a notch and they find a filmmaker with a distinct vision and they let that filmmaker do their thing. I think what happened with Suicide Squad, David Ayer having one version of it, and then DC turning that film over to another company to edit it together, I think that was a big mistake, and the tonal jarring shifts in that movie basically did it no favors and undermined the experience quite a bit. So again, Suicide Squad, not a good movie, but I guess entertaining enough that I bought it for some reason. Basically, because I'm very anal retentive about, I want to have all the ones from this franchise. I mean, I have all the Marvels, including Ant-Man, which I just kind of ragged on a minute ago. But that takes us to Wonder Woman, and that was a great movie. I've talked about it on the podcast. I think what's the best thing about it is that it doesn't feel like it's connected to all these films. As much as I like these shared universe projects, I think that it's easy for movies to get bogged down in it. You've seen that in Marvel and DC. BVS is a great example of that. Avengers Age of Ultron is a great example of that. But when you take a single character and you let them have their story and you let the director do their thing and you don't interfere too much, you get great things like Wonder Woman or Logan or Thor Ragnarok. And I think that studios are, thanks to those films and things like Deadpool, I think that the studios are starting to realize that, you know, audiences are going to go see these regardless. But if you want to keep the longevity going, you just find a filmmaker you trust, put the work in on the script, and let them, trust them to tell the story in the best way possible. And sometimes that'll work, and sometimes that won't. But if the film feels cohesive enough, and the vision is strong, and that you work out before you start making the movie, the results will speak for themselves and only perpetuate more audience goodwill and keep the franchise alive long term. So Wonder Woman, I don't really have a whole lot to say about it because I feel like I just watched it on Blu-ray recently. Gal Gadot is great. The storyline is really strong. The fact that her superpower is essentially compassion and love, and that's what this character is about, I think is a beautiful notion. And I love the fact that they found a way to carve out a very specific niche for Wonder Woman in this mess of a cinematic universe that they've been trying to put together these last couple of years, especially, it's really last year with BVS. Before Man of Steel is essentially just like Wonder Woman, wholly a standalone, and it stands to reason that those two would be the best films in this franchise to date. So Wonder Woman, again, feels very not inconsequential, but it does feel like a separate entity to the DC Extended Universe. So going forward with my expectations for Justice League, I really just want to see, like I said, I want to see Superman's arc paid off. I want to see him come back and become the character that the idealized, iconic version of the character. And I hope that they find ways to make Cyborg and Aquaman compelling enough for them to have their own movies. I know that there's been talk about Cyborg getting his own movie. They announced it years ago when they said, these are the 10 movies we're making. And of course, that it seems like every other day we're hearing about a new movie that they're making. I don't know if Cyborg is really strong enough of a character to carry his own movie, but I guess we'll find out how people react to Justice League and adjust accordingly, or team him up with Flash in another movie. I know there's been talk about that. And actually the Flashpoint comic does involve, to an extent, a sort of alliance between Cyborg and the Flash. I'm excited to see Ezra Miller's version of the character. I'm a big fan of Grant Gustin's, as I've said on the podcast before, on the show on CW. So I'm hoping that he distinguishes his Barry Allen from that one in an interesting way. And, I'm excited to see what they do with Flash in his own film when we get to Flashpoint. And Jason Momoa as Aquaman. That's been a character that's been openly mocked on Entourage for a while, and is, talks to fish. They've done things on Family Guy and things like that about how he's, He's such a kind of a joke of a character now, and it was basically yellow spandex back in the day. So I think that their take on the like kind of surfer guy, aesthetic for him is a wise choice. I think Jason Momoa has just the right attitude to sort of pull that off, and I'm excited to see the ensemble here kind of play off each other. Early reviews have been mostly positive so far, and they have praised the dynamic between the cast members, and I think that's really the most important thing. It's from what I've heard, the story and the villain and Steppenwolf have really been kind of a mess, and I think that's par for the course when it comes to these team movies. Often in the Avengers, we had a great villain in Loki, but why was Loki a great villain? Because we knew him in Thor before that. That's why when it came to the Avengers, we already had a connection to this guy. We already understood this guy. If you take Thor away and you just look at Loki in the Avengers, he doesn't have quite the same. He wouldn't have quite the same weight. He wouldn't be the pinnacle of the MCU villains if it wasn't because of what they established in Thor. They had an arc for him in Thor, in Avengers, and Thor the Dark World, and then Thor Ragnarok that's really carried over between all those different films. And so they've kind of developed him with each release. And Steppenwolf, he's in a moment in the Ultimate Edition of BVS, and that is it pretty much. He's basically an emissary of Darkseid as far as I know. And, they're fighting the parademons or whatever, and who cares? It's not about that. That's just the MacGuffin. The Steppenwolf and the parademons and Darkseid's plan to conquer Earth, whatever, all that crap is the MacGuffin to get the team together. The Avengers they fight their own army of faceless, alien creatures or whatever, and the story in the Avengers is not that interesting. Loki taking his army, want to come to Earth and rule shit. That's it. What makes it work are the actors, is the characters, is the chemistry between them, and that's what I'm hoping for Justice League to succeed in. If they nail that, if Ben Affleck brings it as Batman, and once again, if they balance the sort of spectacle and grandiose vision of Zack Snyder with the character beats and the ensemble storytelling that Joss Whedon has nailed so well, since of course they brought him in on that project to kind of help direct the last bit of it, and I think he also has a screenplay credit as well, as far as I could see on IMDb and stuff. If they're able to blend those two together, I think that's the perfect marriage. As a longtime Zack Snyder fan, the storytelling stuff has never been his strong suit. It's more transferring the images to screen and creating these really iconic moments and shots and things like that. Things like Watchmen. That film works not because it's an amazing screenplay, that story that was written, because it's basically the Alan Moore graphic novel just almost taken verbatim for the screen. What makes it work visually is the fact that Zack Snyder carries that. He has a way of executing a style. And that it says a lot that most of his film, pretty much, I think, actually almost all his films that are based on previous source material, whether it's Dawn of the Dead or 300, Watchmen, or the DC movies now, they're all based on comic books or other films that came before, and he knows how to sort of emulate that style and bring his own unique spin to it. It's with things like Sucker Punch, the original stories, that I feel like he really falters on. So bringing in someone that understands character and story like Joss Whedon, and someone who can make it look alike, because let's break it down. Zack Snyder, as a director, Zack Snyder is a much stronger visual storyteller than Joss Whedon. The Avengers is a great movie because of the writing, because of the characters, but it's not shot the best. It doesn't have impressive cinematography. It's not Blade Runner 2049. It's definitely not The Dark Knight, or even Zack Snyder. Even BVS is an amazing looking movie compared to the Avengers, just from like a cinematography standpoint, from the way things are shot and the way it's presented and the colors and all that stuff. Zack Snyder is better at that than Joss Whedon is. And so bringing those two together, I'm hoping will result in a really strong story for these iconic characters, bringing them to the screen for the first time. And the fact that, we've almost got this movie 10, 15 years ago with Wolfgang Peter. Well, I know he was going to do BVS with George Miller, I think, was going to do it. There's been a bunch of people that have been attached to Justice League movies over the years, and the fact that we're finally getting one is impressive in and of itself. That being said, I do think that the DC Films company should drop the whole DC Extended Universe thing that they don't really seem to like that much anyway, and just embrace the DC. Just call it, here you go, the DC, the DC Cinematic Multiverse, or take cinematic out of it completely because it's too close to Marvel's cinematic universe. Just call it the DC Multiverse. That's all you need, because the toys are already branded DC Multiverse. That opens up the possibility for you to do a Justice League movie, another Wonder Woman 2, a Joker origin story if you really want to do that, even though I don't really think you need to do that. But different versions of Batman, Flashpoint, blah, 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 and just jump around and take more of the X-Men approach where this is Logan, it's an X-Men movie, but it's technically a Western. Here's his Deadpool, it's an X-Men movie, but it's technically a comedy. This is New Mutants, it's an X-Men movie, but it's technically a horror movie. And try and find that balance between it's all connected, but not necessarily have it be so tightly woven. I think calling it DC Multiverse opens that up, and it opens up the possibility for you to even tie in the TV shows at some point if you really want to have them cross over ever, which they probably won't because Marvel hasn't even done that and all their things are in one continuity. But that way you can say, the DC Multiverse, this is Flash over here, Ezra Miller's Flash, this is Grant Gustin's Flash over here, and you can have those coexist without people being like, well, they're in separate continuity. Well, no, they're all different timelines, they're all different multiverses. This is Earth 2, whatever, this is our Earth 37, doesn't matter. And I think that's the way they should brand this going forward, because that way they can just tell the best stories possible. Make them connected if you want to make them connected. You can have one string that is connected, where it's Man of Steel, BVS, blah, blah, blah. But that way you don't feel the pressure of everything having to tie into each other. The way that Marvel has done that beautifully, and I love the way that Marvel's done that. And I think that that's Marvel's thing. And DC needs to not stop trying to chase Marvel's storytelling approach and find their own. And I think the multiverse has always been their thing in the comic books. It's carrying, you see that on The Flash every week. People hopping back and forth from different Earths all the time. And I think taking that same approach that's worked in the comics and bringing it over to the films, it only makes sense. DC likes to, revamp, reintroduce things, restart timelines and all that stuff to have different alternate versions of different characters. And I think that's the smart way to do it. So that's my 2 cents. Not that anybody at DC or Warner Brothers is listening to this podcast, but if you are, that's what you should do. Make it happen. That's all I have for now. I've rambled on quite enough about DC films. As you guys can tell, I'm very passionate about the DC characters. Mostly, Batman's always been my guy, but I've always been a long time fan of Superman. Growing up watching Lois and Clark, I've seen all of Smallville, the animated stuff. And now with the Wonder Woman movie, Gal Gadot's portrayal there, actually the animated one from 2009, is a lot of fun as well. And watching The Flash every week on the CW, reading the Flashpoint comic, which is great. And the Justice League Flashpoint Paradox animated film, that's wonderful. A lot of the Justice League ones are really good, actually. Justice League War seems like it's mostly going to be kind of the similar storyline / approach to what this Justice League movie is doing with Darkseid and all that. So check that out if you want to see that that take on the Justice League's origin. And that's all I got for now. I had a lot to say about this. This was a lot of fun to talk about. Especially, since we give the Marvel side of things such heavy play on this podcast, I felt it's only fitting to finally wrap up my last DC films review and touch base with Man of Steel before we get to Justice League. Kind of talk about where the series, the franchise started, where it's going now, what I hope to see out of it. and all that. So I hope this was enjoyable for you guys to listen to. You can rate and review the Crooked Table podcast on iTunes if you'd be so kind. Also find us on Stitcher. You can find me, Robert Yaniz Jr., on Twitter at Crooked Table. We're also on Facebook and the other social medias. I've actually started posting more things on the Crooked Table Facebook page than I used to. I've been sort of sporadic with posting things on there. Of course, mostly, movie news, kind of sharing and being like, oh, this is interesting. And in addition to, our own content and that kind of thing, just trying to keep you guys in the know. And, a lot of times you never know which of those stories I'm going to end up mentioning on the podcast. You, of course, find more podcasts, reviews, videos, and other movie-related goodies over at crookedtable.com. On the next episode, in case you haven't been able to tell by now, we're going all in on Justice League. Talk about Zack Snyder's newest addition to the DC Films Multiverse, which is what I want to call it. But it's not official yet, so I just have to keep my fingers crossed. Till then, I've been Rob. We'll catch you around the table next week. Roll credits.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved.
CROOKED